Otherwise, it's going to become chaotic. So I'll introduce myself. I'm Professor David Bowman. I'm the Professor of Pyrogeography and Fire Science at the University of Tasmania. I'm also the Director of the Fire Centre Research Hub. And this evening is actually a good example of the purpose of the Fire Centre Research Hub, which is basically to facilitate communications about bushfire related matters and encourage community discussion and also collaborative research interactions with stakeholders. So what we're talking about tonight is something that I think is quite important. It's called the Bushfire Mitigation Measures Bill 2020. The purpose of our meeting is to discuss what does it mean. To give you a little bit of context and background, I really have no context or background about this bill. I was approached by a journalist to comment on the bill. I had no understanding of and had never heard about it, so I suggested they sent me the documents. And the documents which accompany a legal text basically explain that this bill is to develop some sort of pathway to streamline fire management and manage fire risk. And in one of the documents, it says to protect human life, property, natural and cultural values from bushfire disasters. And it's to set up an overarching framework to manage risk. Then you read a little bit more that if this was a playing card, it seems to legally trump a handful of other pieces of legislation relating to natural and cultural resource management in the state of Tasmania. But what I very quickly apprehended is looking at the bill, it's a legal document and I'm not a lawyer. So I said to the journalist, you really need a legal opinion on this. I don't know what this is. It's effectively a foreign object to me. So I, through the Fire Centre Research Hub, because we have good collaborations that have been developed through that I was very delighted actually to be able to recommend Jan McDonald and Phillipa McCormack, who respectively is Professor of Law and a lecturer in law with an interest in bushfire management, to really basically field some questions about this and to read this document to provide some understanding of this proposed piece of legislation. So what's going to happen this evening is basically Jan, Professor McDonald, Jan is going to provide some sort of very quick, accessible summary of what this bill is. Then Phillipa is going to talk about really the centerpiece of this piece of legislation, which is a so-called Bushfire Mitigation Plan, a BMP, if you're into acronyms. And then we're going to move from the abstract legal to one dimension, and I would stress just one dimension because, as I said, there are so many dimensions of this bill which seems to at least override or interact with threatened species, land use planning, national parks and reserves, the Wellington Park, weed management, nature conservation, environmental management and air pollution, Aboriginal heritage, historic cultural heritage, and Crown land. I mean, that's an extraordinary, it's like probably a legal sweep through, as I said, natural and cultural resource management issues in Tasmania. James Hattam, the Chief Executive Officer of the Tasmanian Land Conservancy, is going to talk about just one facet of how this bill would impact on land management, just from a particular perspective. But I must reiterate that this bill seems to impact all sorts of land management, natural and cultural resource management, including national parks, and critically, and a major silence, as far as I could see, in the documentation, and I will discover if this is true in law, about any interaction with the Tasmanian Aboriginal community, which is an extraordinary omission given the increasing awareness of cultural burning and the very central place Aboriginal fire management has in bushfire management, both in the past, the present, and ideally in the future. So I'll hand over to Jan, and she can very quickly provide us a sketch of what this is, so we can understand some sort of legal framing, because as I say, I can't, I'm not equipped to understand this. So I look forward to Jan's comments.
Thanks, David, and welcome to everybody, wherever you are on this beautiful island that we all call home. And I want to acknowledge and pay my respects to the traditional owners of this island, Lutruwita, and pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. I think that the point that David made just now about the silence that this bill reflects in relation to Indigenous expertise and experience and custodianship is one of the many issues that are problematic about the bill that we hope to tease out. The idea of tonight is really to help you all in your preparation of a submission to the consultation process for the bill. Submissions are due by the end of this week. It may be possible, if you write and request an extension, for you to get an extension if time is short because of the public holiday this week. But please feel free to write questions in the chat or add your comments in the chat so that we can field additional questions if you might have them. It's important to recognise at the beginning the scope of this legislation. The bill is about addressing the bushfire risks relating to existing development. There's a separate process through our planning regime dealing with resolving bushfire risk arising from new development applications and new development activities in the state. So just to understand from the beginning that what we're talking about is existing risk in existing communities and on land where activities are already happening. The object of the bill, as it's articulated, is to facilitate the mitigation of the risk of bushfires, importantly, whilst balancing natural and cultural heritage values. And my general feeling is that the bill is really about the first part of that, facilitating mitigation. And it actually has very little to say at the moment, and in my opinion, not enough to say about the second part of that, how it facilitates the protection of cultural and natural heritage values. It focuses on the impacts of bushfire on natural values rather than on at all the impacts of mitigation activities on cultural and natural values. So I think that that's an important thing to bear in mind. There are two sort of key elements to this act as I see it. The first is on what it describes as clarifying accountability for landowners and occupiers. And I'll speak about that in a little bit more detail in a moment. And then the second is on this streamlining of approvals for bushfire mitigation works, what might be described as a one-stop shop for bushfire mitigation activity. And that's what Phillipa is going to talk about in a little while. Let me start by taking you through the implications of this first goal, which is to clarify accountability. The first part of the legislation imposes a duty on landowners and land occupiers to proactively manage bushfire risk, to undertake measures to prevent fire occurring or spreading from their land. And the way that this obligation is framed, it makes it clear that owners and occupiers hold the duty to undertake these mitigation, not a duty, but the duty. The responsibility rests entirely on their shoulders. It's part of a broader shift nationwide towards this idea of risk sharing, which essentially means shifting responsibility onto individual landholders, partly in recognition that they are perhaps best placed to conduct those activities, but I think more importantly in recognition of the fact that the public purse can't possibly afford to do all of that mitigation work itself. So this is an obligation that applies to both public and private landholders. So parks, the Forest Service, Crown Land, all owe this obligation. Private landholders also are under the duty to conduct these mitigation works. If land is owned by one person but occupied by another, for example, a farming leasehold or even a residential tenancy, the obligation rests on occupiers. So it rests on the tenant rather than the owner. And I find that a slightly problematic proposition in circumstances where the tenant may not have the means to pay for and cover these potentially very expensive mitigation activities. The Act is very, very light on both any kind of guidance in relation to how it will be determined whether this duty is met and the consequences of failing to meet the duty. So really, the only things that it really talks about in relation to giving effect to the duty or meeting this duty is that a landowner or occupier must comply with any relevant standard approved by the Chief Officer of the Fire Service and comply with any applicable guidelines. There is no requirement that guidelines or standards exist, and we don't know what the content of those standards or guidelines might be. So if the bill is passed and becomes law before guidelines are introduced and before standards are implemented, we're essentially buying into a duty the contours of which or the scope of which are unknowable at this point. And I want to return to that issue of the guidelines in just a moment and talk about the processes that the Act contemplates for developing guidelines. But if I can just finish off on this point about the duty itself, I see it as a really problematic obligation in circumstances where landowners might be under conflicting duties in relation to the management of the land. And obviously here, national parks is a clear example of where there are clear statutory obligations about how land is to be managed. And we don't have any clarity about how the duty to mitigate bushfire risk sits in respect of those conflicting duties. Similarly, as I'm sure James will talk about, private landholders who have conservation covenants over their land may be constrained in respect of the kinds of mitigation activities that they might conduct on their land. So there are real problems about how this duty will be understood in the context of conflicting obligations of land management. But the Act also says very little about the consequences of breaching the duty. It provides that a hazard reduction notice can be issued if you don't follow through on the duty, and you will be billed by the fire service for the costs of them undertaking measures if you don't comply with the notice. those things aren't actually new. They're under the Fire Services Act, and it's fair to say that those notices haven't been used very extensively to date. So we don't really know whether bringing them under this legislation will actually change very much in respect of those obligations. But they're quite extensive. The notices are to deal with any kind of fire danger, form fire breaks, and clear land as may be required. So there's that implication, but the other wider implications of breaching this duty to undertake mitigation works remain unclear under this Act, or under this bill. It's important because undertaking certain mitigation activities could actually expose landowners to an increased risk of common law liability, so liability to neighbouring properties in negligence or nuisance. The common law at the moment is such that we know that if you start a fire on your property and it escapes and causes damage to a neighbouring property, you're almost certainly going to be held liable for that. There haven't been any cases to date that have held someone liable simply for having a heavy fuel load on their property. So if you have an obligation to clear fuel and you do it by starting some kind of controlled burn and it gets out of control, by giving effect to your statutory duty under this bill, you could be exposing yourself to common law liability. And I think that that's an issue that really deserves closer attention and clarification under this legislation. The final point I want to make is to return to the issue of the references in the bill to standards and guidelines. There's these two types of document that are referred to in the legislation. One is to standards that are approved by the Fire Service, and the other is to guidelines, the process for developing which are prescribed in the bill itself in clause 33. It's worth noting that neither one of these sets of documents must be developed. It's contemplated that they may be developed, probably even that they will be developed. And the explanatory documentation talks about the fact that the bill won't come into effect until guidelines are developed. But we haven't got any statutory protections to ensure that that's the case. So there are some standards that are already approved under the Fire Services legislation, and one might assume that those are the standards that are being referred to in clause 5 of the draft bill. But it would be nice to see clarification of that in the draft itself. In terms of the guidelines, it's contemplated that there might be a whole range of guidelines developed in respect of bushfire mitigation on different types of land and for different land with different kinds of management objectives. But having said that, as I mentioned, they're not required under the Act. And the other aspect of the guidelines that's problematic is that there's no opportunity for public participation in the development of the guidelines. In fact, we probably won't even see them until they're presented to Parliament for disallowance. Parliament doesn't really get to debate them. It's just a case of allowance or disallowance. And I think it's problematic that we're trusting that these guidelines will look good, that they'll have robust content, without having any real sense of what they might contain at the time that the bill goes to parliamentary consideration. Finally, there's also the risk that there will be not just multiple, but potentially competing sets of guidelines, because clause 33 defines or allows for more than one minister to prepare guidelines, either the Emergency Services and Fire Minister or the minister responsible for managing the relevant land. And so you could have a situation where you've got one set of guidelines that is in tension with the other, and there's not really a lot of clarity about how those tensions would be resolved. So those are the main issues in relation to that core foundational goal of the Act, which is to clarify accountability and responsibility issues. And the other key aspect of the Act is the formation of this one-stop approvals process for a bushfire mitigation plan. And I'll hand over to Phillipa to address that issue.
Thanks, Jan. Some good contributions on the chat as well. And so what we might do is, if those people who've made a contribution there want to sort of contribute to a question and answer session at the end, we'd love to hear some more detail. I will do my best to kind of zip through this part of the talk so that we get an opportunity to hear from James and then to answer your questions. But as Jan said right at the beginning, there are these two kind of big components to this bill. And the first is this idea of the duty being on the landowners and occupiers. And the second key focus of the bill is on simplifying approvals processes for bushfire mitigation activities. Again, as Jan said, this is for existing properties, so it complements the planning processes that we have in place for new developments or for applications for new uses of land. Bushfire hazard management plans are the sort of process of the planning schemes that form a part of new approvals. So this bushfire mitigation plan process looks like it's designed to kind of complement that, to address the gap that we have, essentially, that once you have a bushfire hazard management plan and then your development is complete, there are fewer instruments or opportunities for upkeep, for maintenance and enforcement of that. That said, the bill, it seems to respond to some complaints that we've seen in the media, especially following the latest Black Summer bushfires. Complaints that approvals processes can be hard to navigate, they can be complex. There are obligations under a whole host of different pieces of legislations to conduct mitigation activities on private land and on public land in some cases. Interestingly, and I just want to point this out, the Natural Disasters Royal Commission doesn't necessarily agree that this is the case, only that people reported that it was an issue. And I just, in saying that, want to note the fact that in paragraph 90 of its interim observations, which is what we have so far from the Royal Commission, the Royal Commission notes that we've heard of the complexity and the variation in approval processes, and in some cases, there appears to be a need for practical guidance for land managers and the broader community. There's a strong interest in this idea of bushfire hazard reduction activity, but there's a need for further education and research to improve our understanding of the effectiveness of these activities under severe to catastrophic bushfire weather conditions. So you'll see that the Royal Commission is not proposing necessarily that approvals need to be consolidated or that we need a one-stop shop to be able to do this well. But there is an underlying concern that this bill and others like it may be used to advance an environmental deregulation agenda. And you'll see why some of those concerns have been raised in just a moment when I sort of list some of the acts that we will see sort of exempted under the provisions of the bill. So the process that the bill establishes is that first an individual may apply to have a bushfire mitigation plan or a BMP approved. It's firstly reviewed and then endorsed by the Tas Fire Service and can be measured, as Jan said, against standards that might be issued by the Chief Officer. And then final approval or endorsement of the mitigation plan is from the Bushfire Mitigation Measures Panel. And I'm going to tell you a little bit more about the panel in just a moment. There's some concerns about how that may be set up and how it might operate. But the effect of this bushfire mitigation plan process is to exempt actions taken under the plan from all other approvals. And the provision is expressed in very broad terms. And so it's section 16 and it says, if the panel approves a mitigation plan in respect of land, bushfire mitigation measures, which may include hazard reduction burning, or as Jan said, clearing, fire breaks, or other sort of clearing activities, may be undertaken on that land in accordance with the mitigation plan. So you need to comply with the plan that you've had approved, despite any requirement under an act for a licence, approval, permit, consent, or other authorisation for the work, and despite any covenant or other restriction. So the provision is extremely broad. And the kinds of legislation that would be caught up under that exemption include the Forest Practices Act, which establishes the Forest Practices Authority as a regulator and a code for managing forestry processes and private timber reserves. But that act requires forest practices plans for certain activities that must be certified by the regulator. And those plans, that act, requires that a person not carry out or cause or allow the carrying out of certain activities without a certified forest practices plan. And that includes clearing trees, clearing or converting threatened native vegetation communities, and constructing a road, for example. And there is a very detailed legal framework wrapped around that. There are some issues associated with that framework, but it is a complex legal framework associated with managing forestry resources, which and all of those provisions and all of that framework would be exempt of the provision in this bill. The Threatened Species Protection Act, of course, requires a permit before you're allowed to take, keep, kill, trade in, process or disturb listed species of flora or fauna, including on covenanted land. And there's financial penalties associated with that and possible jail. So to exempt that series of permitting processes without a clear indication within the bill that those issues, those problems that the legislation was designed to resolve, the loss of native species from Tasmania, will otherwise be taken into account by someone in the decision-making process is concerning. It exempts the Land Use Planning and Approvals Act and the planning schemes that sit under that act, which broadly impose a requirement for a permit for uses or developments that are required to have a permit, and in many cases that includes clearing vegetation. National Parks and Reserves Management Act, you can't cut down a tree or damage or otherwise destroy a tree or a fallen tree on reserved land without approvals. Interestingly, the Protected Area Managing Authority is already empowered under that legislation to take, and I quote, any steps or undertake any activities that the Managing Authority considers necessary or expedient for preventing, managing or controlling fire on reserved land, having regard to the management objectives of the reserved land. So there is already a power for parks agencies to manage the risk of fire, to mitigate fire risk on protected land. And the Minister under that Act, under the National Parks and Reserves Management Act, can provide guidance about how that ought to take place through a code of practice in relation to preventing, managing or controlling fire. And this exemption in the bill exempts the operation of that code of practice and the permitting processes under that Act. Now, there are a whole series of other acts, but because David mentioned it at the outset, just to note with the Aboriginal Heritage Act, the object, of course, is to protect Aboriginal heritage and objects and Aboriginal remains and deeply important places and examples of objects from our incredible history. And it's an offence under that Act to act without a permit in a way that destroys, damages, disfigures, conceals, uncovers, exposes, and so on, or otherwise interferes with an object that's protected by that Act, or to carry out an act that's likely to endanger a protected object. And that obligation to get a permit to act in that way will be exempt under this provision in the bill. So there's some really important protections in legislation sort of across the board. And I think what I really want to highlight in this is that in the narrative and in the media, these permitting obligations are often described as, preventing necessary and important actions that would protect life and property. But they are obligations that exist for a reason, and they are to protect other very important values that the Parliament of Tasmania has seen fit to protect. So the provisions in this bill don't create a framework that allows those kinds of values to be balanced effectively, which doesn't necessarily meet the goal of the object in the bill. Interestingly, the regulations, so the bill provides that regulations may be made by sort of a more detailed legal instrument that's underneath the Act and provide a bit more information about how it might be put into practice and implemented. And the regulations may prevent certain landholders from accessing this streamlined process. So the regulations can exempt particular classes of land or particular kinds of permits or consents or covenants from the exemption section. And it's not clear what the drafters of the bill had in mind here. So, I mean, it's possible, you know, that a conservation covenant holder may lobby to have their particular covenant listed as something, you know, under which you can't access this streamlined process, but maybe the government is considering requiring full assessment processes for certain land uses. But that's not clear. And so without clarification on that, that provision is not perhaps as strong as it could be. Strangely, and I think this is probably a quirk or an oversight in the drafting. As it's currently drafted, it seems to be possible that the Chief Officer of the Tas Fire Service could apply for a bushfire mitigation plan in respect of a single parcel of privately or publicly owned land and have that plan endorsed by the panel without any obligation to notify or consult with the landholder. And we see that in sections 12 and 13. I don't imagine that the drafters of the bill intended for that to be the case, because it's deeply problematic for those that own and occupy land. But it's an interesting oversight. So two really important things come out of that conversation. And the first is, who is on the panel that oversees this process, that will be responsible for reviewing these mitigation plans and approving them with or without conditions? And what factors does the bill provide to guide their decision making? And the bill makes it clear that the panel members will include the Secretary of Premier and Cabinet, Department of Premier and Cabinet, the Department of Police, Fire and Emergency Management, DPFEM, the Director of the Environment Protection Authority, the EPA, the Local Government Authority of Tasmania, or their nominees, and one other suitably qualified person appointed by the Minister. The discussion paper that was released with the bill indicates that panel membership is supposed to allow a range of perspectives to be considered, but in fact this is quite a narrow group of people, most of them based within government, as we saw in the chat already raised that issue. And depending on who that suitably qualified person is, it may not include anyone with any conservation or particular sort of land management or fire ecology kind of expertise. With that voice and perspective may be entirely absent from the process of reviewing and approving these mitigation plans. The membership separates Tas Fire Service's role in the technical content of a plan and the panel's role in assessing whether a plan ought to be exempted from the other acts and the other approval processes, which is perhaps beneficial. And the panel is also empowered under this bill to request expert advice, but they're not required to seek expert advice in any specific circumstances or as a general matter. And in fact, there's an emphasis in the last part of the bill on speed and efficiency, which suggests as a general principle, because the panel's designed to proceed with as little formality and as expeditiously as a proper consideration allows, probably militates against seeking expert advice on every plan, or at least with any consistency. Now, the panel must be satisfied that actions are solely for bushfire mitigation and in the public interest and consistent with applicable guidelines. Again, this highlights the very important role that the guidelines may play, and we have no idea what will be in them. But actions being solely for bushfire mitigation will involve an assessment of the plan that we don't have a lot of guidance about how the panel are going to conduct that, how they're going to test whether proposed actions are for that purpose alone, and where you know, an action may support bushfire mitigation. It's possible that it's also serving other purposes. So we don't have any indication of how the panel will consider that. They may also consider the strategic value of the proposed mitigation measures in mitigating bushfires. And that probably will involve an assessment of the landscape, of the priorities for landscape scale burning and mitigation measures, but that's not clear from the Act. There's no definition of that phrase, and so it, along with the fact that the panel may consider anything else that they think is relevant, is very broad, provides very little assurance that all of these obligations and values from other legislation will be appropriately balanced against the value of mitigating against bushfire, and also provides very little opportunity to question or challenge the panel's decision making. So the process, there's no requirement for public notice of bushfire mitigation plans that are submitted for approval. There are no appeal rights against approval or refusal, and there are no obligations to provide reasons for why a bushfire mitigation plan is refused, for example, and potential concerns about misuse of this planning process for other purposes. And also questions about how to ensure that the panel is considering the right factors. So there's that no express requirement for reasons, which is potentially problematic. So as one sort of final point, the effect of compliance with the mitigation plan after it's approved, if it is in fact approved with conditions in some cases, deserves to be clarified, as does the statutory duty that Jan discussed. It's really important because of the risk of civil liability from burning. And this exemption from legislation will operate to ensure that landholders and occupiers are not exposed to the penalties, often criminal penalties and potential jail terms for breaching the permitting conditions in those other acts, but doesn't necessarily provide protection against those common law duties of care that Jan discussed. So I will hand over to James now to give us sort of an example of how this operates in a very specific context, if I may.
Thanks, Philippa. Thanks, Jan and David, for the opportunity. I'm most definitely not a lawyer. I'm an ecologist, so I'll do my best to, and I've been a long time out of the field, so I'll do my best to just give you a sense, as David said, from a TLC private land conservation perspective, which is just one part. It's great to see a few Conservation Covenant landholders on the session today, but just for everyone's benefit, privately protected areas in Tasmania represent over 900 Conservation Covenants, which protect over 110,000 hectares of land. They represent 600 landholders, and they're diverse as the areas in which they protect. They are scattered all over Tasmania, and they protect values many of which don't occur in our public reserve system. TLC's also a conservation landholder. We own and manage 25,000 hectares of land, and we have a staff of 24 people that are out there managing those areas. The landholders themselves that are managing these properties are doing it on their own. They're doing it with support from a couple of people out there that are out there as stewardship officers to support people. But by and large, they're doing it alone and doing it through their best endeavours and their commitment to their patch. One thing I would say from a fire management perspective, the way that we treat fire is looking at fire in the broader landscape. How do we manage fire with our neighbours? How do we manage fire for the values in which we're protecting our properties for, which is number one, ecological values, but taking into consideration our obligations to protect property and life as well. So one thing that we find when working with landholders is that there's these barriers to fire management. And we're really supportive of programs like the Red Hot Tips program and the Plan to Burn program, which aims to build the capacity, capability and knowledge of landholders. We don't see any of that in this bill. This is basically telling people what they should be doing and not telling them how they should do it. As everyone sort of mentioned so far, one of the other greatest barriers for landholders is that litigation risk. So I don't see how this bill can support someone that is really hard to put fire in the landscape generally, which also increases their risk because these landholders will sign up to another minister saying that they'll protect their land for conservation for these values. But then there's another minister saying that they have to burn it, which may contradict those values that they're trying to protect as well. So from a conservation covenant perspective, legally, landholders have a conservation covenant which is registered on the title of that property. Alongside that, they have something called a nature conservation plan. Under the covenant by nature is a negative document. It's a restrictive covenant, so it speaks in the negative. It says what you cannot do on your land. It does, however, give you the provision that you can have authorisations in writing by the minister. The nature conservation plans gives you that ability to have that authorisation for the minister. And I think, as Phillipa and Jan mentioned, we're sort of a bit perplexed to why this bill has been drafted, because conservation covenants do provide the ability to put fire onto these properties. They provide provisions in the covenant itself to put fire in for fire hazard reduction and for ecological purposes, as authorised by the minister. Through the authorisation is that it gives you the ability to have a conversation with a technical expert. So that person can come out, meet with the landholder, understand what the property is and what the key values that that property is trying to protect, and work out a way collaboratively to manage that from a fire perspective and from a risk perspective. So for us, that sort of is the best. We want to bring people along that journey to increase them and give them those skills. From a litigation perspective, you have other issues as our organisation, and there's other organisations like us all over Australia that unfortunately cannot get insurances to put fire on their properties anymore. So there is a whole collective of Think TLC, but national, large organisations that use fire as a key management tool to manage biodiversity that have no insurance. That is a huge risk to them as an organisation and their entity, but they're taking that risk because they realise that they're managing those places for conservation. Luckily at TLC, we still hold some insurances to put fire on our property, but as Jan said, still by putting a fire on a property, we run that risk every time we do that. The other point I would make, which is challenging from the bill, is that it doesn't take into account any of the existing frameworks that have been established. So the fire management area committees, which TLC sits on a number of, were established explicitly to create a forum for collective, collaborative conversation about fire, bushfire risk management. And that brings people from forestry, from parks, from private landholders, farmers and the like to come together and try. They may be challenging in different ways because you're coming from very different perspectives, because we all are seeing the land through a slightly different lens. As Phillipa said, we might be managing for slightly different things, but how do we find that shared value in terms of how do we want to manage fire in the broader landscape? So we're quite perplexed why this bill is trying to create this one-stop shop and streamline everything, but it's not taking into considerations these existing frameworks and existing bodies that have been established to do exactly what the bill is saying that it wants to do. So we're concerned by that, also by the fact of investing significantly in this space as an organisation. We see fire management as a long-term investment. You know, it probably takes our organisation, as we approach our 20th year as an organisation, we're only now just grappling with how we can put fire into particular reserves and properties that we own. So how can we support landholders in that, on their journey, on their property, as custodians of their land? How can we build their knowledge and their capacity to hand that knowledge on to the next person that manages that property? So, you know, I think it's challenging to say the least. As Phillipa said, the guidelines aren't there, the devil's in the detail, and we have no detail. So it's hard to actually work out how these things work. I have a whole list of other issues that I have with the bill, including the bushfire mitigation plans. You know, you could look at that and go, well, let's try to develop a bushfire mitigation plan for every single conservation covenant in Tasmania. You know, another extra burden for a landholder to do to try and connect these two documents that contradict from different ministers. But I think from our perspective, we're trying to see how we can better streamline things to avoid confusion for landholders. There was another landholder I saw on before that we presented at the Planning Commission this morning about the local planning scheme zoning matters and conservation covenants that run in parallel to the planning scheme processes too. So you have this zoning overlay that totally can at times contradict the potential of a property from a conservation perspective. So I think that all those different things occurring is actually causing more confusion for landholders instead of actually trying to streamline anything. So I'll stop there.
Oh, thanks everybody for providing these different perspectives. And I think what's clear to me that that this is not a mature piece of legislation. It seems very unformed, and that's why I think the public comment option is probably very important, and presumably that's why they've been asking for comment, because it's not a done deal. It's a proposal, technically. But how it will affect individual landowners and affect them in terms of what standard they're meant to achieve and how they're meant to be able to implement this, resource this, and also bear the liability for their actions seems to be a consistent problem. It's just not clear how this works. As an observation, I'm very interested in community engagement and involvement in solving the bushfire crisis. And I suppose the consultation step and building capacity and trust in the community and trying to have a shared journey is very important. And I think that all of these actions need to be handled with great care, because the risk is alienating or unnecessarily making people feel disenfranchised, I suppose, rather than integrated as a whole community, as we're trying to adapt to our new circumstances with the increased risk of bushfire. So it seems to be a very challenging document, and it would be nice if there had been some more explanation from the government or the Tasmanian government agencies about the provenance of the bill and the mechanics, rather than just simply these documents that were circulated with really not a lot of explanation around that. I think that's a fair statement, but I don't know whether there's something I've missed, but there doesn't seem to have been a lot of advertising or preparation in the media.
No,
so,
David, I think that's absolutely right, that there's a lot of confusion about what has driven this bill and where it actually came from. One of the things that I think we're hearing consistently is just that although it's intended to be set up as a framework bill, it really doesn't provide any reassurance in relation to the detail, and that this is an area where we really do need detail. And James talked about the importance of the guidelines, and I think it's absolutely critical that we at least see some guidelines around conservation before this bill can go through. Otherwise, it just doesn't do what its own statutory object is. You know, it only does half of it, which is the mitigation stuff. But Claire Bookless from Environmental Defender's Office has asked a question for you, David, that I wanted to just jump in and pose. And that is whether you think it would be possible to develop guidelines or standards that set out the type of bushfire mitigation measures that are suitable in all circumstances or in particular sets of circumstances. Is that actually something that's technically possible? Or would you have to go down to the individual property level for that to really work?
So a classic academic answer, but it's always qualified. But I was asked to read the position paper the Tasmanian National Parks and Wildlife Service has prepared, a position paper about fire management in the national parks. And they're extremely interesting and valuable documents, which you can go to the website. I don't know whether the public consultation period is finished or not. But my comment with that is that although they were they'd apprehended the key issues really well, the missing step was adaptive management and learning by doing and some sort of evaluation. And I would say that in all fire management, the idea that somebody could write down guidelines that are going to work and be sustainable whilst the climate is rapidly changing and our social and economic circumstances are changing, particularly with COVID, it's clearly unrealistic. So, to be trying to make a very simple checklist that you could achieve this doesn't seem believable. And there are so many areas that we need to explore: smoke management, alternatives to prescribed burning, so different forms of fuel management, different ways of modifying landscapes, the interface between and our structures and our gardens. You know, there's so much work we have to do that we're not in a position where there is a known solution. If anybody, in my opinion, is promoting a known solution to this problem, then I don't believe that those people, they are clearly, and it's not based in reason or fact. It's an ideological view. Because we can see that on both sides of the Pacific Ocean, which different cultural approaches in the United States and Australia. One it's a more of aggressive fire suppression, one which has been more orientated towards fuel management. Both are being wrong-footed by the surge in these major fires. So the fire activity is clearly changing. It's changing at a speed that science can't even keep up. We're seeing new fire behaviours, new sorts of fire phenomena and so on, and new fire challenges. So the suggestion that there could be, you know, a simple checklist without any adaptive management component, without any self-correction, without any evaluation, just does not seem best practice, in my opinion.
And Anna Povey makes a really valuable comment in the chat, David, and I think that this is an issue that several people are concerned about, that given the risks involved in burning, the likely mitigation measure in most cases is going to be mechanical land clearing of some sort. And although the process for the panel considering and approving a bushfire mitigation plan is that it be solely for the purposes of mitigation, I think there is a genuine concern that this legislation will be used as a stalking horse for land clearing activities that will come at the expense of conservation values.
So
throw that out there. See whether anybody responds.
I'm of the view that you know, whether it's, you know, shocking to conservationists, but I'm of the view that mechanical clearing is going to be an important component of fire management strategies. Now, obviously, it's like all of these things, there's a continuum. You know, there's clear felling, you know, the flanks of Mount Wellington. We could do that and burn it to an inch of its life, but we're not going to do that. But we can't get around the fact that Mount Wellington is a very dangerous setting for a city. And so the challenge is going to be developing the interface between the city and the suburbs and the high risk vegetation. And I think that there will be mechanical treatments involved in that. I'm absolutely certain that we're going to, but this comes back to a shared journey and building social license that if you want to, in Tasmania particularly, have you know, endless environmental disputation, it's extremely easy to do that. It's almost a pastime or a cultural feature of Tasmania. So the trick to be effective with fire management is going to be to put a lot of work into community consultation, building trust, showing demonstrations of the sorts of alternative treatments and the co-benefits that can come with that in terms of biodiversity and amenity, safety, reduction in smoke. But also there's got to be correspondingly changes in the way we you know, retrofit our houses, build our houses and heat our houses because domestic wood heaters are an incredibly significant source of smoke pollution. Now, there are very fantastic opportunities, in my opinion, where we can actually close the circle, but we can't do that in a shock and awe exercise effectively, in my opinion, it's going to require a lot of patience and a lot of community consultation. And probably my biggest concern with the Bushfire Mitigation Measures Bill is that it seems to have just not really put a lot of prep into community consultation. Yes, it's true, there is a community consultation step, there's a template you can fill in, but there's no real clear pathway of how those messages are going to be incorporated. Do they just go into an inbox? Do they get published somewhere? Is there going to be further discussion and reflection on what the community says? It just seems to be a compliance step rather than a genuine journey. And I would think, and I'm very concerned about the threat of bushfire. And I know we're going to have to do things differently, and it is going to be confronting to existing values for all perspectives, because there's going to be an enormous amount of change and disruption. But I'm confident that we can achieve the necessary changes, but we can't do it without a lot of groundwork, a lot of community consultation, a lot of talking, a lot of building up capacity and investing in the community and empowering communities. And I suppose the concern with a piece of proposed legislation like this is that it may, although it's clearly trying to solve a very important problem, it may unfortunately be counterproductive, because it does seem like an enormously big stick, and there doesn't seem to be a whole lot of carrot. And the concern of how are people going to be empowered to do this necessary work, or manage their liability, or get the training and skills, or subsidisation. That just doesn't seem, it seems too much on the, as if we've been naughty, rather than maybe people are really, they're really out of their depth. They don't know what to do. So, there are these trade-offs, I suppose. And so hopefully with some more community consultation, maybe this is a really clever play that we haven't realised, that all of the messages which will come back, they will rewrite this, and it will have actually achieved some sort of community buy-in. I don't know.
Yes, so the moral of that, David, is that it's really important that the department receives as many submissions as possible. So hopefully the things that we've talked about tonight will give people some pointers on the issues that are of most glaring concern with the bill. Claire makes the point that all of the submissions do get published on the department website, unless you specifically request anonymity. So there is that element of accountability. And if the bill, if there's overwhelmingly problematic submissions and the bill remains completely unchanged, there would at least be some case for raising wider questions in the media about why these concerns haven't been addressed in the bill if it progresses without significant amendment.
Jan, I was just going to make one quick comment about David's point around appropriate consultation and working together with people. I just wanted to give a practical example, because one thing that we found through the Red Hot Tips project and the Planning to Burn program was people sharing their stories and their experiences is actually the best way for people to learn. And I think Dana Kingdom is a past TLC employee. She's on this session, and Dana's done a huge amount of work for TLC. But to give you that example of one of our properties, the Vale of Belvoir up near Cradle Mountain, for us to develop our plan for that one property took 4 years to develop one plan on one property. So, thinking about these bushfire mitigation plans, how you can develop a consistent and cohesive plan that can stand the test of time, appreciating the different values that are out there in the landscape. I don't think that's fair or Yeah, I don't think that's a way to support people to increase their knowledge and their capacity to learn about bushfire and give them the knowledge that they might need to manage their property, whether it be for hazard reduction or for ecological values.
That's a really good.
We've been exactly 1 hour.
Yeah.
I don't know what the sense that should we draw this meeting to a close, or is there some other burning issues that need to be ventilated?
Pun intended, I'm sure, David. We're not seeing a lot of additional questions on the chat. Yeah, we've been trying to sort of field things as they arise. I suspect that we've probably there's some quite specific questions there that probably don't need to be responded to on the in a group forum. My feeling is it's probably a good time to end, given that we said that we'd go from 5 till 6.
Okie dokie. Well, I'd like to thank everybody for making time to join this meeting, and I'd really like to thank the once again the panellists, Professor Jan McDonald, Dr. Phillipa McCormack, and James Hattam of the Tasmanian Land Conservancy. And I think it's been a really good example of what we were talking about, which is you know, having these discussions. There's a lot we need to talk about in bushfire. And that's one of the purposes of the Fire Centre. We need to have a lot of discussions, learning. We're all feeling our way. We're all trying to figure out how the agencies and the community can work together, because the agencies who have a stake in fire management, it's absolutely clear in their, they sometimes talk about their doctrine, is that there is an expectation that the community will bear a very large amount of the responsibility, you know, the effort and the cost. So we need to, obviously, as a community, we need to discuss what that looks like. How do we do it? We're learning as we're doing. And I think that's where, you know, the fancy word adaptive management is really apt here, that we are in a cycle where we have to iterate. And as we go through these things, we've got to cut each other slack, learn to work together. And through that process, I'm 100% certain that we're going to be in a much better space, but it's going to take a lot of time and effort and trust and conversation. So thank you, everybody. And we look forward to seeing the submissions. Thank you for pointing that out, that they can be up on the website. And thanks once again to the lawyers who were able to read something that I immediately looked at and said, no, I don't know how to read that. Okay, all right. Thank you very much.
Thanks, James. Thanks, Philpa. Thanks, everybody, for joining us tonight.